I want to welcome everybody this morning. We have a fantastic turnout going here. We're really pleased to have you all because this is a really important meeting with the city. We also have TEAM Punta Gorda on board helping us with this. And so welcome. Mitchell Austin and Greg Murray are going to be your speakers today. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Murray, our current city manager who's been on.
Yep, thank you. What I really wanted to do is just concur. We certainly need to look at our land development regulations and form-based codes when we determine what the future of Punta Gorda wants to look like. We want to develop the envelope and the densities that various builders can look at and work from as a platform to develop much of the property that's currently available in Punta Gorda, which is ever shrinking as we move forward. I just wanted to provide assurance that what we're looking for, and I know what our urban design department is looking for, and specifically the council, is citizen input and involvement so that we can actually use that input to help craft the LDRs and form-based codes that we need to allow the city to move forward in the future. So with that, really turn it over to Mitchell. He's got all the details and the information, the man with the plan, and we'll provide you some good information on where this is going and how we're going to get there and what you can do to help.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mr. Murray. I really appreciate you being here and sharing that with the public on the line here. And I am Mitchell Austin. I'm the chief planner of the city of Punta Gorda. I've been with the city for 17 years and lived in the city since 2008. So going on, what, 14 years, I guess. So this town is very near and dear to me. Briefly, I wanted to go over the presentation outline, much like Sherry intimated in her opening comments. The place where we're at today is a part of a process that really began many years ago, stretching back into 2017 with some of the development projects that were occurring within the city. In late 2018, the city council directed staff to look very closely at what our development entitlements were. And based on some of that input, they said, we really need to relook at the whole thing. We need to make sure that we're doing things that are appropriate for our community and fit within the context. So they started with the citywide master plan process in 2019. And based on that document, which is really a vision document that provides sort of a range of potential options for how development could proceed in an orderly manner in the city. City council said, okay, well, where does the rubber meet the road? And it starts with the comprehensive plan, which is required by the state of Florida. So that's our official planning document required by the state. So we needed to make some updates in there based on recommendations in the citywide master plan and direction from city council and the public. And then sort of the part 3 of that, where we really have an impact on how the city gets built over time, is updating those land development regulations. So briefly, I will go over a little bit of the background on the comprehensive plan update and then talk about the difference between a comprehensive plan and land development regulations. Briefly, form-based codes as compared to conventional zoning, which conventional zoning is more or less what we have now with our current land development regulations. And then next steps as far as the process moving forward and how you can engage the city with this process as the public. So with the comprehensive plan, we're updating 5 elements: future land use, coastal management, housing, transportation, and historic. That comprehensive plan update process began in the first quarter of 2020 and was wrapped up in late last year. First draft was presented to City Council late last year, and based on that and some of the recommendations that were in there, City Council really wanted to pause that process. And dive into the land development regulations so that we could understand what those development rights might actually mean in terms of the built environment of the community. Their primary concern, as with our primary concern as residents of this community, is how does the town look and feel over time? You know, we like it the way that it is. There are things that we would like to see that get better, and other things that we would like to see remain unchanged. And development can really radically alter the face of a community in good and bad ways. And we want to make sure those bad ways don't happen. And I think I definitely want to applaud City Council for taking this one step at a time and really making sure that we're meeting the expectations of the citizenry and meeting our goals as a community in terms of economic sustainability and fiscal responsibility. So coastal management wise, in that element, it's really talking about waterfront access and coastal risk. So there are just policies in there related to boating access and promotion of water related activities, and also some information about how we can over time adapt to climate change and continue to look at that to ensure that our community is viable moving into the future under those potential risks. The next piece of the puzzle was the historic element, and there's really two tracks there where we're looking at, okay, well, how do we ensure that we're protecting those buildings that are important to our community to the maximum extent possible? And also, how do we use our historic charm and character to promote the city and have a more sustainable business environment? The next element that we looked at updating was the housing element, and that was to better recognize the senior and assisted living facility housing needs that may be out there, update our list of partners with various entities within the community, and exploring opportunities to provide incentives to the development community to provide a wider range of housing types and price points, particularly within the core area of the city. The transportation element, which the city had a very good transportation element to begin with, roadway network wise, we're pretty much built out. So it's really about focusing in on, well, where are key intersections that would help our community address some of the traffic inconveniences that we currently experience today, particularly during the high season, and where are areas where we can continue to enhance bicycle and pedestrian access. The city, since the mid-1990s with its initial sidewalk development plan, has really focused very strongly on enhancing that environment for bicyclists and pedestrians. And, you know, some of it's transportation, and a lot of it, given the character of our community, is really recreation. I live in Punta Gorda Isles, and my friends and neighbors, myself, my mom, we all walk around and bicycle at times, and to be out and about in the glorious weather that we have, particularly this time of year. So it's an important part of our community. The big rubber meets the road part of the updates is really the future land use element. And the intent there was to update the policies to ensure that we were getting greater flexibility for annexation growth areas and providing appropriate development rights within that core downtown area. The two areas that you see highlighted here, the orange box and the yellow box, those are the areas that City Council specifically directed us to look at in the future land use update and subsequently the land development regulations, because that's their area of concern. The areas where I live and many of you live, in terms of Punta Gorda Isles, Burnt Store Meadows, Seminole Lakes, those areas aren't changing. There's zero change recommended for any of those areas. They will remain the same. So that's an important thing that I want to point out. So drilling down into the downtown area, what I like to call the greater downtown area, we're taking a hodgepodge, the current future land use map looks like this on the left-hand side of the screen, and turning it into a much more focused collection of future land use categories in order to encompass the sort of development types that are currently seen in those areas, and we want to promote, encourage to continue. So the first one is the downtown area. This is the commercial core of the city, of course. And currently we allow a mixture of uses to occur there. Retail, dining, offices, and multifamily residential are permitted by right. So the major change in the recommendations here is an increase in residential density. Currently, it's limited to 15 units an acre, and the proposal of the draft comprehensive plan is for 35 units an acre. So to give you a picture of that, the image of the Sunloft Center, a building that we're all very familiar with at the heart of our downtown, that building has 15 units of residential on the 4th floor. And the consultant said, well, if you took the 2nd and 3rd floor, which are office space, and say that those were residential, this building envelope that you see here could produce somewhere between 32 and 45 units an acre. So 35 seem to be in the realm of reasonable possibility within the sort of general constraints that we have now in terms of the developable envelope in our downtown. So the next future land use category is village center, and these are centered around the Fisherman's Village area and the hospital area. So within that area, within those areas, we're again looking at a mixture of commercial and residential development, office and retail. And those are a little bit smaller scale. So again, when we looked at residential density, we're looking at about 30 units an acre, which is an increase from the current entitlement of 15. And the comparison here is Fisherman's Village, which is only a 2-story building. And if you assume that the 2nd floor was all residential, which of course we all know it is not, you could get about 21 units an acre in the current buildable envelope of Fisherman's Village. And that's just assuming that the pier without the parking is the actual entitlement. So, you know, the 30 seemed reasonable from a planning perspective. So the next future land use category is the traditional neighborhoods. So these are the neighborhoods that flank the downtown and the 41 corridor to the east and the west. So these areas were platted between 1884 and really the 1920s. So they're really built on a very traditional pre-automobile planning type of scale. So they're distinctly different from the rest of the city in that manner. So in those traditional neighborhoods now, there's a wide array of housing types, from single-family homes with accessory dwelling units, duplexes, and small multifamily developments. So when we looked at those and we looked at existing densities, they were in the range between 22 and 33 units an acre. And we know that there are areas within those traditional neighborhoods, historic properties, for instance, are key portions of clusters of historic properties, historic districts per se, where we may want densities to be lower than that. And there are other areas like immediately adjacent to the hospital where we have large quantities of undeveloped lots, where it may be appropriate to increase those residential densities to entice residential development to occur there. So the net residential density that was proposed is 25 units per acre. And again, that's more or less in line with what's buildable now, but there may be some variation across those orange areas on the map. So the final future land use change is really the flex commercial corridor. And this is the corridor that's along 41 from Airport Road north to the southern end of downtown. It's an area that's flanked, by those traditional neighborhoods. So the spacing of intersections, the number of streets, the size of the blocks are all really that historical context and size. And we looked at adding additional residential entitlements to this area for the redevelopment potential of some of these sites. I mean, we all know that this corridor is primarily dominated by the ghetto auto dealership empire, which I'm not in any way disparaging them. They're one of the largest private employers in Charlotte County, so they're a very important part of our current economy. However, we all have more than likely a cell phone in our pocket. I work and my employer provides me with a cell phone. So I have 2 cell phones in my pocket. And one is my shopping center and entertainment venue, and the other could be my everyday office and the place where I get my work done. So the commercial picture, as far as hundreds of thousands of square feet of commercial retail space or office space, are highly in question moving into the future. The pandemic this year or last year and this year has really highlighted those changes that were already occurring in the background in the market for commercial real estate. And we anticipate that those things will continue moving into the future. And remember, when we're talking about our future land use plan, we're really talking about a document that's looking 15, 20 or more years into the future. So we're really laying the groundwork for the community as it will be another generation forward. So within that area, we're looking at residential densities of around 25 units an acre. And again, that's to allow enough residential intensity to permit the conversion of commercial at times when it is appropriate in terms of market conditions. So it's really looking at the future. So I've talked a lot about the comprehensive plan, and we're all here today to hear about land development regulations. So many of you may be thinking, well, what the heck are we talking about? But that's really the foundation, the groundwork for where we are at now, so that you can understand better where we're going and the fact that we're not taking this, this is not our first look at this. The comprehensive plan is a broad policy document. It's data and analysis. It's over 1,000 pages long. The real rubber meets the road portion of that is goals, policies, and objectives. And if you pull those out of the document, they're maybe 40 or 50 pages long. And then there are some maps, which are critically important to understanding those goals, objectives, and policies. So those out of that document, that's really the primary mover and shaker, which guides the land development regulations. So as we discussed, land development regulations are where the rubber meets the road. It's the only place where we as a city can have a city, a citizenry, a community have any impact on the way that private land is developed. Land development regulations are specific rules that govern the development of those private lands. They generally specify the types of uses that we anticipate on seeing. So broad categories like residential, commercial, institutional, or in our case, we already have some mixed use classifications. And then specifications for how things should be built or where they should be built in terms of setbacks, building heights, parking requirements, landscaping, and signage. So land development regulations are 3 interrelated concerns. They're that use density bucket, their form, and their management. How do I, as a private developer, get through the process of developing what I want, whether I'm building a single family home or a mixed use building in the center of our downtown. So those are the 3 concerns. However, conventional zoning much like the zoning that we currently have in place, is primarily interested in this use density piece of the puzzle. And then they talk about a lot about management, because we have to follow state laws and local ordinances and have reasonable due process for development. And then way over here in the corner in this brown square, we talk about form, generally in rather abstract, non-concrete ways. So conventional zoning has a great deal of shortcomings. We mentioned this building, one of these buildings earlier. From the city's current land development regulations, both of these buildings carry the same zoning classification. And to the land development regulations, both of these buildings are the same. They meet more or less the same buildable envelope. There was a variance for one of these buildings, but it was just for 9 foot of building height. Standing on the street, I was trained as an architect. I can't tell the difference in height between these two buildings, but you know, it's there. I can tell the difference as an average person, that they look different, and they definitely interact with the street in different ways. One has active street frontage with a restaurant opening and the lobby into the hotel. And the other on the public street has basically a fire exit. And, it's pretty blank. So but from a regulatory perspective, both of these buildings are the same, more or less. So another metric that you typically see in conventional zoning is what they call floor to area ratio. And that's a way to measure sort of the intensity of development on a site in terms of the ratio of the land area to the floor area. Both of these diagrams demonstrate 1 block of developable land with a floor to area ratio allowance of 1. So with 1, you could have a 1-story building that covers the entire parcel of land, or you could have a 10-story building that covers 1/10 of that same parcel of land, probably surrounded by a sea of parking. But these two things, if you're just looking at floor to area ratio, a measure of intensity, are identical. So you don't have any predictability in terms of the form that the city may take if you're dealing with that. Another thing that codes really focus on, and something we've already talked about with the comprehensive plan, is density. And density is a measure of residential intensity. How many residential units can I have on an acre of land? And these images, both of these pictures are local. They're both neighborhoods that are around 4 units per acre. The one there on the one here, of course, is in downtown Punta Gorda. And while some of this area is much higher than 4 units an acre as originally done, this streetscape right here, because there are some vacant lands and some lots that are occupied by some buildings that occupy multiple lots, is about 4 units an acre, just the same as this conventional subdivision, which is just outside the city limits. There may be a preference for one over the other. However, we know that this conventional subdivision, as it were, doesn't look anything like our traditional subdivision. So we have to be careful with density and make sure that we're getting the type of development that we want, not just assigning a number. So going back to those 3 interrelated concerns, form, use, and management. And again, conventional zoning is really focused on those abstract ideas of uses and density. Form-based codes, by contrast, which is the type of land development regulations that are proposed for the greater downtown area, form is the organizing principle. Form-based codes were initially developed by people in the design industry, primarily people who were trained as architects. So their problem with conventional zoning, and the reason that they started developing these form-based codes, is that you could build a great building, but right beside it, somebody else may build a building that fits the zoning code that completely negates the building that they created in terms of building the cityscape. So when they develop form-based codes, the organizing principle is the form. We're concerned about the way that private development shapes the city. So of course, these types of codes also have management and density and use components. But again, those are just necessary components where the primary driver is, are we getting from private development the buildings that fit the context of the town we expect? So within form-based coding, there are a lot of differences. Conventional zoning map covers broad swaths of area with the same zoning classification. So this is, again, the city of Punta Gorda. The entire loop annexation parcel, which is a couple of 100 acres plus, is covered by the same zoning classification. By contrast, about the same size, this map from a form-based code in another community shows each one of these colors, each one of these shades of purple is a different classification, a different type of development is permitted. So these blocks that they show are more or less the same size as a city block in Punta Gorda, sort of 400 by 400 or 200 by 200 in the downtown area. And even within one of those blocks, you could have an area with a different type of development. So again, with form being the organizing principle, form-based codes are really looking at the relationship of buildings to the streets in which they encompass. And it's really about creating or thinking of the street as a public room of the city. So just to give you some perspective, the city of Punta Gorda has a wonderful park system. We have about 100 acres of parks. Our public road infrastructure occupies a space of about 900 acres. So a 9-to-1 difference. The primary component of our public realm is really our streets. And form-based code says we need to think about them more carefully. So building to street relationships within our community, you have a downtown, you have a traditional residential neighborhood that are markedly different than, say, the sort of conventional zoning that you would see in other places of our city that were more built around the automobile. So a different scale, a different context, a different type of development that is occurring in those locations. So form-based codes really focus on a concept called the build to line. We want to tell private developers that we want you to build in this area so that you can frame that streetscape and create that wonderful environment or enhance that wonderful environment that we already have. So just to give you a little bit more detail on what you'll be hearing about as we move into the public participation process for updating or for creating this form-based code, there are many elements within a form-based code. So you start with an illustrative plan. There's a concept called the Transect, which is critically important. There's a regulating plan, which is essentially the zoning map, and then building form standards and public realm standards. So these last two pieces of the puzzle, these are what's really value add for our community. This is largely missing from our current zoning code. So illustrative plan wise, this is actually from our citywide master plan, which was accepted by City Council in 2019. And if you zoom in really close, like I have here, you can see a little section of the downtown area where it's really talking about where buildings are and where we think buildings should be in order to enhance the feel of our existing community. So to give you a very specific example, we have Marion Avenue and this is Taylor Street right here. This plaza, this new plaza area, That's really the 100% corner of our community. That's where we already have like the Christmas tree that we just took down, the community Christmas tree. A lot of community events pass along Taylor Street, parades, in better times, events, etc. So within this citywide master plan, we identified that as a very important area to add to the public realm, to create a new plaza space. With a conventional zoning code, it can be incredibly difficult without entering into something like a management agreement. So in our current code, it would be like a developer's agreement, where the city would provide certain things and the developer would provide certain things. It's almost impossible for conventional zoning outside of that to require something like this. However, in a form-based code, we can really bake something like that into the actual development requirements. So they may take a different form or shape than what's illustrated here. But the principle of having additional public space in this critical area of the city could be a component of developing those form-based codes. So I mentioned the Transect, and it's a weird word, but it comes from weird people. It comes from the scientific community, specifically from ecology. And the transect, the ecological transect that you see here is an illustration of the Canaveral National Seashore on the other coast. If you flip this over in your mind and just mirror it and put the ocean on this side and the intercoastal on the ocean side, you basically have the same transect here in Southwest Florida of ecology. You have an ocean, a beach, you have beach dune ridges, you have oak canopy forest and upper and higher elevations, you have a mangrove swamp. So that's really within each one of these transect zones, within each one of these categories, you would expect in the ecology to find a different type of plants and animal species, and they may be unique to that specific zone and can't or don't live in the other zones. So it's an organizing principle for studying ecological systems in biology and nature. So taking it to us, humans, we're obviously biological creatures, but we create our own habitats. And we have a human habitat that runs from really rural places. Some of us live in very rural places, and some of us live in extremely urban places. And really, we're somewhere in between those. But within each one of these habitats, there are different building types and different levels of public infrastructure and different forms and shape of the community. So the form-based code is really, the transect is one of those organizing principles to help us understand what levels and scales of development are appropriate given the context. So it runs the gamut from a natural zone all the way to an urban core, or what they call an assigned district. Realistically, within the city of Punta Gorda as it exists today, these are the types of transect zones that we have. Our downtown is really sort of an urban center in scale. Urban core would be more like downtown Sarasota or Fort Myers, and an assigned district, maybe downtown Miami, or a specialized district like a university or an airport. Within the city, again, the urban center is our downtown. And then on the other end of the spectrum at T1, about 45+% of the land area of the city is actually natural zone. It's part of the state buffer preserve, or it's other environmental lands owned by the city, county, or state. So we have the benefit of having all of these areas. And of course, like myself here, a lot of us probably live in this T3 zone, the suburban zone, which would be like Punta Gorda Isles. So what we're looking at, or what City Council asked us to really focus on, is what a form-based code, Transect, would consider the T5, the urban zone or downtown, and urban general zone, so adjacent traditional neighborhoods and other sort of commercial or potentially mixed use areas that have the same pattern of infrastructure in terms of blocks and streets and water and sewer and sidewalks and all of those other amenities. So on your screen now is an example of the part 3, the regulating plan. And this is from a transit station plan in Long Island. So ignore the facts and details, but the principal takeaway here is that transect zones can be interspersed dramatically within an individual block and certainly across multiple blocks. So the total area that's shown on the plan may be 100 acres. To put that in context, the entire area that we're talking about, the greater downtown area, is about 900 acres. So we anticipate that there will be still areas where the transect zones will be largely the same, and then there'll be some subzones or subcategories in order to better encompass the types of development that we anticipate. Another piece of the puzzle with form-based codes, the fourth piece, and now we're starting to get into those pieces that really distinguish form-based coding from conventional zoning, is building form standards. Now, you know, there may be some misinformation out there that we're going to require buildings be built in exactly certain way, and that there'll be some sort of uniformity or you know, overarching architectural style or consistency or something nefarious, government imposition on private development. And that is entirely not the intent of form-based coding. It is really about prescribing the big picture. What types of heights are we looking at in buildings? How many you know, increments of floor space are we going to provide to for the development of private land, in terms of building heights, how those buildings address the streets. So you know, in this example, which is on the screen, they have a specific type of development that they want to see on a primary or commercial street, as opposed to on an apartment or townhouse street. You know, this is the type of development which is appropriate. So it's really about prescribing the types of, or sort of assigning the types of buildings that we anticipate to see within the community in their appropriate location. So you can get a little bit more detailed than that in terms of providing specific building types that are basically a footnote, a guide to the private sector development community to say, hey, if you're in this area, you may want to consider these building types as appropriate because they fit all the code. So this is really a visual guide both for us as a public for understanding what types of buildings we're going to be permitting through this process, and also provide certainty to the development community that there is a way to build the buildings that fit the plan and fit their economic or financial models for their development. So the example over here, the illustrative example from the town of Port Royal, South Carolina, this is Low Country, South Carolina, and those building types are more or less in line with that context. So we would expect to see similar things in Punta Gorda. Punta Gorda has, fortunately, a very eclectic collection of architectural styles. Our current codes denote that there are 8 distinctive styles. I think that there are potentially more, and potentially some that we do and don't want, and we need to have that conversation as a community. But the building styles In order to keep the charm that Punta Gorda already has, it's critical to remember that we need to have that eclectic mix because that's what we currently have. Another piece of the puzzle within building form is architectural standards. Now, in a typical form-based code, architectural standards are actually optional. There are many form-based codes that exist here in Florida, around the country, and around the world that contain absolutely no architectural standards at all. You could build a building any style you wanted to, as long as it fit those building type standards so that it fit within the envelope of the development site. However, we know as a community going into this and have been directed by City Council and been told many times by the members of the general public that architectural standards are critical, that we want buildings that look like they fit with the historic character of the area. And in order to do that, there will be architectural standards. As I said, we have architectural standards in our current code, but as the city manager intimated too, you can drive a hotel through some of the loopholes. So we need to make sure that those fit our community, are appropriate, and are easy to regulate. So the fifth and final piece of that's within a form-based code and something that you will not find in most conventional zoning is public realm standards. And that's both dealing with any public areas or plazas that may be within the form-based code area. But more importantly, it's dealing with and assigning street types. So we know that some streets are primarily residential, some streets are main streets like Marion Avenue, and some streets are downtown streets that aren't main streets like, you know, Sullivan, which may have a different character entirely. So it's another tool to make sure that we're matching the private development to the public infrastructure, and that we're creating the look and feel of the community that we expect as a citizenry. So with all of that, I want to quickly wrap up. We have next steps in the process. As I said, the comprehensive plan update was paused. So we have a rough draft, which is available for view and comment. The land development regulation update, we just had a project kickoff meeting with our consultants last month in January, and they are diligently working on preparing background information and workshop materials for our first public participation process, which will occur in March. That will be an interactive engagement session, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The ultimate goal here is to simultaneously adopt, once we as a community are satisfied and the elected officials are satisfied as representatives of our community, the comprehensive plan update and land development regulations in early 2022. So that's our current project timeline. So a little bit more into the milestones for this land development regulation project. The highlighted words, public workshop, public workshop, public workshop, and the Planning Commission and City Council, those are the primary public input sessions in addition to what we're having today, which is not in the consultant's work, but a city portion of the project. We have a code workshop, code framework workshop, which is really looking at developing that regulating plan based on community input. So because of the ongoing COVID-19 issues, this is primarily going to be a virtual workshop. There will be a couple of different sessions. It's intended to be a hybrid workshop, so there will be an in-person component. However, that in-person component is really targeted to people who are unable to engage in the workshops through the technology, or just uncomfortable dealing with those. So we're trying to identify an appropriate place where we could gather a reasonable number of people, allow a reasonable number of people to gather if needed, socially distanced and all following all the CDC guidelines, to ensure that we don't endanger the community through that public workshop. But again, primarily virtual, and it will be highly interactive, I assure you, with lots of polling and question Q&A and all of those good things, so that we can get a sense of where we're going and where we need to go with the project. The next step will really be code testing, which currently in the plan is targeted for July. And that is really a show and tell of what the draft code, based on that initial public workshop, could look like. So the consultants will take example projects, example parcels that we give them. So real world projects from our community, real world parcels from our community, and provide, basically the consultant will take those and build a development project based on that site and the code that they've drafted. So those examples would be presented to the public in some way. That meeting is initially targeted for July, knowing the character of our community and the concerns with the seasonality. This workshop may need to shift, and that'll be based on council direction. But generally, the next public input point would be December, after we again revise the code based on the code testing and public feedback. That will have a public presentation of that for city council and the public. And then based on that, some feedback period there, 30 days, et cetera, that we would then consider scheduling adoption hearings for the comprehensive plan and land development regulation updates, which would go to Planning Commission and City Council. And again, those are public meetings where input is sought and appreciated. So with that, I want to say one last thing, which is the comprehensive plan update and land development regulations will, once we start getting into having something, will be available for view on the Plan Punta Gorda Master Plan website and the city website. And you can always contact the city Urban Design Division if you have any questions or comments. Again, the comprehensive plan update is online and available for your viewing pleasure. And we would definitely love your comments and questions on that. And then, as I said, as we move along, those websites will be populated with more information about the land development regulations, including hopefully a copy of this video. So with that, I will turn it back over to Sherry so that we can talk about questions.
So yeah, thank you so much, Mitchell. You gave us a lot of information to consider. And I think it's really good for us to begin to understand some of the terminology, because this is a really, for a lot of us, I think this is a very new concept, some very new concepts. So yes, we have some questions that have come in. The first one is the downtown marketplace. And again, this is something that I think that all of us is near and dear to our heart. And we have this question in our lives all the time. It has served as an ad hoc public square for festival activities year round, and it's also provided supplemental parking. So what's going to happen in the future? Will Lashley and Gilchrist Park really provide a venue for those activities? The activity space and parking cannot accommodate needs now on a normal day in season. So where can we look for our new venue? Or are we going to have in our form-based codes a requirement that a developer provide that sort of service if they do develop in that spot? Yes.
So that's a really good comprehensive question and super important. I know, having been here for 17 years, that parcel is of primary importance to the city. Looking back into the past, that's actually the location of the original Hotel Punta Gorda, the Grand Hotel that was the signature of the city from its founding through the 1950s. That parcel is the sort of centroid, the center of gravity of our community. I think the existing work that we've already done with the The comprehensive plan and the citywide master plan recognize that fact. As I illustrated in the presentation, under the current land development regulations, it's really incredibly difficult for the city to do anything to entice, and some might use the word force, which is an ugly word, the private developer to ensure that those types of amenities that we've come to expect in terms of allowing public space, events, parking, public parking, there's really no way for us to enforce that under our current zoning code. However, we have, through the form-based code process, the opportunity to think critically about how we would want to encompass those things. How do we require or incentivize public space to be provided on that private development site, public parking to be provided on that development site? How do we make that happen? So those are things that can occur through the form-based code process. So I anticipate that we will have a lot of community discussion about that very point. And it is good to have that community discussion. Just to put it in perspective, the total asking price on that piece of land would exceed the total amount of the initial capital investment that the city put into developing Lashley Park way back in 2006-07. So it's a very expensive piece of land from a physical perspective, which I think the city manager would be more capable of addressing. It would be very difficult for us as a community to say, yeah, we'll just buy it, take it off the tax rolls and develop it as a park. So we need to figure out a way to make it work for us, both physically in terms of our city budget and tax base, and have it work for us as a community as that important public space that we all enjoy today. Sorry.
Another question is that someone said, I didn't see a discussion of public transit. Is this included in the plan?
So currently, public transit in Charlotte County is provided by Charlotte County. They receive funding through the Punta Gorda, the Charlotte County Punta Gorda Metropolitan Planning Organization. And again, those are federal funds that are passed down through that organization for providing transit. Charlotte County's transit development plan, which the county has not really moved forward on some of those components and pieces, but for many years, it has identified the downtown area as downtown Punta Gorda area as a potential location for sort of a circulator shuttle, and also the need for some sort of express service that is provided along the 41 corridor and connection to the Punta Gorda Airport in order to move visitors and residents through the county. However, the moving from what we currently have, which is a dial-a-ride system, to what those types of systems would be, which are more of a fixed route system, requires substantial both capital, which is largely funded by the federal government, and operating, which is more of a 50-50 split between the federal government and the local entities, expense. So there are some major expenses involved in moving to a fixed route transit system and providing transit in the community. It's certainly something that we as a city have looked at before. I mean, way back after Hurricane Charlie, we had, because we had so many vacant lots, we had our downtown business community on their regular gallery walk nights. They would provide a circulator trolley to move people around the town. So there are potentially some public-private opportunities to look at in the future. But really those are policy decisions that are driven by City Council, Charlotte County, and whatever the funding mechanisms are at the federal level under the current transportation bill.
Okay, great.
Mm-hmm.
Another question. Due to changing building codes like elevation requirements, does the city have established grading ordinances in place to protect existing properties in the historic district?
And that's a very good and timely question. There are many blocks within the city of Punta Gorda that were platted many years ago, all the way back into the late or early 1880s, where the infrastructure that's been built around them in terms of streets and roads and water and sewer systems and drainage are actually at an elevation equal to or higher than some of the low points within those blocks. So you get in certain areas a little bit of a basin effect where there's no positive drainage from those lots onto the street. Under the regular standards of the Florida Building Code, private properties are required to provide positive drainage from their site, not impacting adjacent private properties, but flowing that water to the nearest drainage infrastructure. So in a master plan community, it may go to the detention pond behind your house. In a place like Punta Gorda, it primarily flows to the public streets for that positive drainage. So the development pattern that we have, there are a mix of vacant lots and existing historic structures. Those existing historic structures are lower in elevation and may never have had any site fill or grading provided to them. So they may represent the lowest points on that block, but obviously they're developed, and preserving those historic properties is important to us, not only to the individual private property owner, but to us as a community as part of our character. So there's a little bit of a conflict there, or an issue that we need to find a thoughtful way of addressing. And we've got a lot of partners there in terms of within the internal city structure. We have planning, zoning, my side of the house. We have the building division who regulates the building code. They're the people that you pull permits from if you're doing work on your structure or property. And then we also have the public works division who's responsible for the drainage on those streets and public rights of way. So we've got to get everybody sort of on the same page to address this problem. Is it a problem that occurred overnight? No, it is not. It's really a problem that dates back to the 1880s, the original platting of the city. And it really wasn't an issue, especially in the period from, say, the 1970s onward, because there was largely no development in these historically platted areas. So within the last 10 years, we've seen probably 50 years worth of development within those areas. So the problem is rising to the surface in more ways than one. And we definitely need to figure out a thoughtful way, a cost-effective way, and a way that is equitable to address those issues.
Okay, great. Another question about affordable housing. Dover Cole, in their presentation in the final master plan, talked about affordable housing being a way to provide incentives to developers. For example, a portion of units in a project being made a part of affordable housing. How does that fit into the overall planning?
So affordable housing are providing additional entitlements for the number of residential units, or providing some other incentive to entice a developer to produce affordable housing. Is a tool that's used in some communities. You can also increase the affordability of the overall housing stock just by providing a wider array of housing types. So in our existing zoning code for the traditional neighborhoods, it's neighborhood residential 10. And most people think of that as a single family zoning classification within these historic areas, but really it's not. It's a zoning classification that permits by right somebody to build an accessory dwelling unit on their property, or for somebody to build a duplex on their property. And those entitlements They weren't my idea. They stretch all the way back to the beginning of our zoning code, way back in the 1950s. So it's a legacy of a way that we used to develop. We used to have in grand single family homes, if you're looking at the late 19th century, we would have had, the primary home for the wealthy merchant, and they would have had servants' quarters. So that accessory dwelling unit, being a small scale housing unit, could be affordable to somebody who's working and living in our community. The other side of the coin in terms of housing affordability is that we've got to ensure that we have the housing types that the market will expect moving into the future. The baby boom generation, which the vast majority of our community, given our demographics, is baby boom generation. They've driven the housing market their entire lives because they're the largest cohort of individuals. Moving into the future, if you look at the outer edge of that planning horizon, the baby boomers will be a less and less important part of that housing market in terms of the demand for housing. So we have to ensure that as a community, we have the variety of housing types that are going to be attractive to millennials. Now, I say the word millennial, and even in my own mind, I have to catch myself because we think of like kids. Well, the oldest millennial turns 41 this year. So the millennial generation is actually in their prime family creation, household creation years. This is where they're starting to buy and buy housing or rent significant quantities of housing. And by and large, because of the sort of economic conditions that they face, the cost of education and other considerations, their disposable income or their income available for housing is significantly lower than what the baby boom generation faced at that point in their housing lives. So the dynamics are going to be really different moving into the future, and we have to ensure that we have a way to accommodate that. From a local perspective, the hospital. If I'm, not a doctor, not a high-end, specialized nurse or other healthcare professional, I'm earning a professional wage. I may be making $40,000, $50,000 a year, but where's the affordable place where I'm going to live in our community? And given the opportunities in Charlotte County, they may actually look to Lee County. Well, what if those people, after driving back and forth to Punta Gorda for 2 or 3 years, say, wait a second, I'm passing 3 other hospitals to get to my place of employment. Why don't I see if they're hiring? So we may not have the workforce that we require and expect if we don't provide those types of housing.
Okay. Another interesting question. Do Seaside or Celebration, which are towns here in Florida, I think most of you know, or Carmel in California, and I want to make a note here that Celebration is the Disney town connected to Disney. Seaside is a charming, well, in my opinion, a charming community up in the northern part of the state. And then, of course, I think we all know the looks of Carmel, California. Do they use form-based codes?
So I can't speak to Carmel because I haven't looked into it. West Coast example, I don't know. I don't live on the West Coast. Well, the West Coast of the United States. We all live on the West Coast of Florida. So Seaside and Celebration are definitely examples of communities that use form-based code. Both of those are unique examples because they are communities that were developed from scratch by a master developer. Seaside is actually the foundational community for form-based coding. That is the original development. That project was developed by a single developer. He engaged the services of Dwani Plotter Zyberg out of Miami. There are a couple who has an architecture firm. They both are lecturers at the University of Miami, College of Architecture. In the 1980s, they developed this sort of new model for developing a new town, and that is form-based code. So those are examples, but they're different examples because all of the land was initially controlled by a master developer, by one person. So the look and feel of those is distinctly different from the way that Punta Gorda looks and feels today, or would look and feel under an appropriate form-based code. The objective is not to have, the village set piece. Celebration was used, or no, Seaside was used in what is it, the Truman Show movie several, I guess, decades ago now. Gosh, showing the age. So it's this fairy tale land. It's a beautiful place, but it would be entirely inappropriate to expect Punta Gorda after 20 years to look like Seaside. That's not what we look like now, and I don't anticipate that that's what we want to look like in the future. But they are excellent examples of how you can build a community that has more value than the adjacent sort of conventionally built communities in that area. Seaside, Elias Beach, Rosemary Beach. There are several sort of new urbanist developments which use form-based coding as their regulating principles. And the housing costs per square foot in those communities are sometimes double and triple the housing costs of the similarly situated, i.e. close to the beach, conventionally built single family or even multifamily.
Okay. Interesting question again. Do we have enough employees in the planning and zoning office? Mr. Murray, I don't know if I should let you answer that or Mitchell.
Actually, I will take that on initially and then pass it over to Mr. Murray. I can say for a fact that in my 17 years with the city, the number of people working in planning and zoning has actually shrunk, not grown. The major shrinkage was due to the economic downturn and the housing crisis in the 28 through 2010-12 sort of time frame. So I can say that I definitely feel the lack of warm bodies doing productive work. But I'll let Greg take it from there if he wants to say anything additional there.
Oh, I do actually. There are several things that need to be considered when we think about the number of employees that we have currently. For example, if you look back historically before the recession, we had 85 employees in the Public Works Department. Now we have 60. So with the number of buildings that we have here in the city of Punta Gorda that the city owns and maintains, including Herald Court Center, our City Hall, the Annex, any of the other complexes, we basically have a person that handles all the internal work that we need done in those facilities. If you look at Gilchrist Park and other park structures, we have a person that handles the needs in those parks and can't always keep up with that. We have one electrician that goes around and makes sure, even in Herald Court Center, all the lighting fixtures and the bulbs and different things are currently, some that currently need replaced are being kept up with, and an A supervisor that tries to fill all the holes. So we've had a substantial decline overall from recessionary period till now. Now, that being said, when we look at our revenues and we're preparing us for this year's budget presentations, our revenues are just now coming back to the level with all the changes that have, even with the changes that have been made to where they were in 2008. So we are just now getting back to having the amount of revenue coming out of recessionary times, 5 out of 13 years that declined, even with the growth that we've had of coming back to 2008 levels. So during that time, it's been difficult to continue to move forward like we need to with many of the issues that the city faces. So given that, when we look at our current long-term plan and our fiscal needs, we're going to be looking at what do we need moving forward to be able to maintain the infrastructure, and how does that impact our employee base and other fiscal needs that we'll have as we move forward with our pro forma for the next 5 years budget and extend our strategic plan a little before a little more than just the detailed operating management plan for the current year. So that there's a lot of issues there to address, and you'll hear much more of that as we go through our budget process, but certainly a good question and something that we have to deal with as a challenge as we move forward.
And I will say, as a private citizen who has worked considerably with the city, you have no idea how much is accomplished by these few people. They are the hardest working, easiest to get along with, most, I don't know, great staff. I have to commend all of you. You do an excellent job, in my opinion.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say they are. We have 292 people that are a great staff to work with. It's thin enough, the proverbial rubber band, you stretch it thin enough and it breaks. So if we want to continue to progress with things that we need to do and address in the city, we have to address that issue also.
Exactly. An interesting question about climate change. How does what is being discussed address the growing problem of climate change, and in particular, rising sea levels and catastrophic weather events?
So that's a really excellent question. And it's not something that we shout about a lot, but here in the city of Punta Gorda, we've actually been very much on the leading edge of addressing the climate change issue as far as adaptation. The city had an adaptation plan that was initially adopted way back in 2009. We just recently completed an update of that plan. Portions of that update actually influenced some of the recommendations that are in the draft comprehensive plan update. So we're looking at those things and we understand where the potential risks are. The good news for our community in general is that based on the current sort of consensus scientific evidence and the structure and nature of our city, we're really 40, 50 years ahead of the curve in terms of experiencing any really catastrophic impacts in really small areas of the city. You get out into that 100-year horizon, then there are substantial areas of the city that may be impacted. And it's critical now. This is a really slow moving emergency. It's critical to begin now to look at those things, minor incremental changes to the way that we produce infrastructure, the types of infrastructure that we use, to ensure that we're giving ourselves the next sort of increment of development or life cycle costs of those pieces of public infrastructure in terms of protecting the human assets of the city in terms of both public and private developments.
Okay, a follow-up to the question about the number of staff. Someone asked, and I think they're talking about our revenue. Why did it decline? Isn't property tax the biggest generator? Greg, can you just briefly kind of talk about why we're, that situation?
And property tax is one of the biggest generators, but from 2008 to 2013, our property tax continued to decline on an annual basis. And even with the growth that we've currently experienced, we're still over the last 13 years, 0.5% below where we were in 2008. So we've not come back yet and completely recovered from the recessionary period. And during that time frame, of course, it's been difficult to put a long-term plan in place that does everything we need as far as our capital needs. When you build new buildings and 10, 12 years ago, those buildings last for a while, but we're coming back into that cycle now where they require substantial maintenance, substantial people to maintain those structures, things that we need to accomplish that we haven't been able to do, and in some cases weren't necessary at the time because you had newer infrastructure. That infrastructure is now aging, and for our people to be able to keep up with the increased needs is really difficult at the time. But the main reason being property tax certainly is one of our main sources of revenue, and over a 13-year period, we're still 0.5% below where we were in 2008.
And one more kind of follow-up question I related to this. Our volunteer police force is a great example of using citizenry. And so they're asking, the Punta Gorda Police Department benefit a great deal from their volunteer force. Could the city augment its staff with a more organized volunteer? Greg, I'm gonna let you answer that.
You said, could the city staff?
Be augmented with some volunteers.
Oh, well, certainly, volunteerism is very important. When you look around the city and what volunteers are doing now, everything from maintenance of nature park to community gardens to, painting buildings. I know when we met with TEAM Punta Gorda, some of the paint your heart out things that are happening now, to different projects that come along. Look at the Mural Society and the different things that they do. We have volunteers everywhere. And if we didn't have these volunteers, city staff would really be behind the 8 ball, so to speak, because we would have to do all that with the city staff. And I'm certain that many of the things you see and drive by on a day-to-day basis wouldn't be as nice as they are now, because we'd have to maintain them at a different level. We can always certainly use more, but at some point there are certain things that the city staff has to accomplish because of either technical or liability issues that we have to address. And when it comes to things like specific maintenance of buildings and requirements that we have, we certainly need city staff to do that. The volunteers on many of the projects that we have help us tremendously. And without these volunteers, we would be a lot further behind than we are now.
Okay, thank you. I want to get back to our topic at hand of form-based codes and LDRs. And someone asked a question that pointed out that Winter Park and Winter Garden in Central Florida are perhaps more representative for successful comparisons of our area and our vision. So Mitchell, do you have any information about their use of form-based codes?
Yes, indeed. So Winter Park in particular, I have less familiarity with Winter Garden, although I do have a little bit on the periphery of that one. But Winter Park is definitely an example of a downtown area that's been a traditional existing historic downtown area that's benefited from form-based coding. One thing to look at critically when you're looking at these types of comparisons, though, and what they may require versus what we could require, is the economics of the community. Winter Park definitely benefits from the fact that several thousand rich kids go to Rollins College every fall. And they spend their parents' money liberally on Park Avenue, which is the retail street, the main street of Winter Park's downtown. So the market dynamics there are significantly different than in a community like ours. However, from a standpoint of how their community has been built out and enhanced over the years through better form-based codes, better zoning, as it were, that's a very good example of the types of development that you can see with these types of regulations in place.
Okay, another question about density, and I think this is probably something that's not really understood very well. I don't understand it very well. And that is, so you're talking about density specific numbers like 35 and 50, but you don't specify the size of units. Without specifying a height limit, these densities are meaningless. Are we talking about 3,600 square feet or 35,000 square feet units? Again, I think, probably this is something that we're all having a little trouble understanding what exactly the.
Yes, and again, this is the problem with abstraction. In most conventional zoning codes, you really talk about the number of units per acre. And in our future land use, our comprehensive plan updates, you typically only talk about residential densities. Just to give you an example, Charlotte County has 3 residential future land use categories: low density residential, which is up to 5 units per acre, medium density residential, which is up to 10, and then high density, which is up to 15. Our existing comprehensive plan more or less mirrors those as well. And that's a sort of a conventional suburban relationship in terms of residential densities. At 5 units an acre, you're primarily talking about single family. That's the only unit type that sort of fits within that, consuming that much land area. Then you move into a more small scale, like duplex, multifamily, when you get to medium density residential. And then at 15 units an acre, you're talking your typical suburban, apartment complex, which I think any of us on this call may have lived in one point or another during our lives, in our early 20s, the 2-story apartment complex, with a parking out in front, surrounded by a handful of poor little sad trees, and that we drove to our first jobs from. So those are the types of residential densities that give you suburbia, conventional suburbia. As I stated, our downtown area, the core area that we're talking about, is not conventional suburbia. It's more traditional, pre-World War II, pre-automobile dominance type of development pattern. So the residential densities are much higher. In terms of building scale and regulating building scale, that's why we're moving towards form-based codes, is to give us a much clearer picture of what buildings should look like and how they should fit within the context of the existing community. So one of the examples that I showed, and I sort of breezed past it, so you may not have recognized it, but on Goldstein Street in downtown, so immediately across the street, more or less from historic City Hall and the council chambers, there is a 2-story building, a fairly large 2-story building. That 2-story building is the Schoolhouse Square Apartments. Originally, that Schoolhouse Square Apartments was the schoolhouse for Punta Gorda. That 2-story building has was chopped up into 10 apartment units many, many years ago. So the density on that site is 33 units an acre. Now, are those apartments huge? Are they 3,600 square foot single family homes? No, they're primarily 1-bedroom or studio style apartments from, I think they're like 400 to 600 square feet or less. So that building is something that would fit with the character of our community. We need to make sure that our land development regulations tell developers that 35 units an acre means that, not a high rise in the beach area in Fort Myers may have the same 35 unit an acre entitlement, but they're huge luxury apartment or condominium homes, and they're 10, 20, 30 story buildings surrounded by 100 acres of parking lot and just preservation land. So the scale of development is hyper important. It's hyper important to me, not only as a planning professional, but to me as a resident of the city. Through this process, we will not be looking at high-rise type development to fill these sort of density requirements. Also, when we constrain the building envelope, we're telling developers that they need to build smaller units. Smaller units are more affordable on a monthly rent or monthly mortgage payment perspective than the 5,000 square foot single family home on the 10-acre plot. So we're getting that natural housing affordability into the mix by providing these places.
So we are not talking about increasing building heights. We are talking about an envelope within which a developer can possibly put 35 units per acre, but
Correct.
doesn't necessarily going to do that. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And could I interrupt just a moment? That's a very good question, and these are the crux of the whole land development regulations and form-based codes. What does that envelope look like that we can actually apply that density to? So those are the discussions, exactly why we're here now and why we paused the comprehensive plan, so that we can see that envelope on actual properties. And maybe Mitchell can touch on that a little bit, the actual properties when we want to apply these and show exactly what that will look like at various densities. A developer can have, one big building with one big apartment that has huge vaulted ceilings and have a density of 1 if they want to. But when we look to be extreme, but when we look at that density, that's exactly what they have to fit that density into. So that's what's going to really drive what our buildings look like. But I also needed to interrupt just because I'm going to have to excuse myself. I have a meeting with the county at 11:45. I'm trying to squeeze some money out of them for the city. So that's not something that I should be too late for. So I apologize, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to allow us to explain some of this and start developing questions that you have with everyone that's out there, because that's exactly what we need so that we can advise the council on what we want to see moving forward and what kind of decisions they're going to need to make. So I certainly appreciate that, and I apologize that I have to step out, but if I can squeeze some money out of someone else for us, that'll be a good thing to help make up that deficit we have right now.
Absolutely. You go over there and get us some money, please.
I would like
very
to.
much. Thank you very much for coming today.
Also,
a question about the kind of combined density, and I think we talked about density and height maybe and answered that question. But there are also some questions about parking. That the parking situation is a concern of a lot of residents here. And one person made a comment that to drive by schoolhouse apartments that you talked about at night and see parking all over the street and across the street on a vacant lot, there's not enough on-site parking at those apartments. How are we going to address parking in this new comprehensive plan?
So in terms of the current land development regulations, there are definitely some challenges in terms of the way that we think about parking, and there may be there is some room for adjustment there to make sure that we're parking the uses appropriately for the context. Another piece of that puzzle is the regulation of parking on our public streets and rights of way. It's something that is already become an issue within the historic district area, again, because we've seen that growth of new residential construction and the provisions that are in place there. We see a much higher utilization of on-street parking. So that's a concern with the community. And we haven't really regulated parking on our public rights of way for 20 or 30 years since the new Justice Center was built, when prior to that, all of those parking demands were encompassed in the area where the old old county courthouse is, the historic county courthouse is. So there's definitely more thought needs to go into that from a policy perspective, both on the public infrastructure side and on the private development side. I will say that parking is a very expensive component of development. So if you're developing land, if you're developing a property, even in a suburban area, parking costs, absent land costs, are up to $5,000 per parking space. A parking space consumes about 500 square feet of land. If we're talking about, some areas may be appropriate for those studio type apartments, a developer may look at that and say, well, I'm going to have to pay, another 5, 10, 15, upwards of, if you're talking structured parking, $30,000 per parking space in order to accommodate residential development. If that studio apartment is only, a couple hundred or 400 or 500 square feet, it may be the same size as the parking area, and the costs may be 30 to 40% of the total cost of building that residential unit for a member of our community to live in. So we have to be careful and consider parking. Obviously, you don't want not enough parking. Not enough parking is a problem in a residential area. Not enough parking in a commercial area, I'll have to say, is what we call success. When there's a parking problem and nobody goes there anymore, that means that most of those businesses are probably very successful because they're packed with people. So we all, and I drive every day. I drive to work. I only live 3 miles away. Could I walk or bicycle? Sure, but I choose to drive. I choose to bring my car into the downtown area because it's easy. It's easier. But we have to be thoughtful about where we put cars and how we put cars. And our expectations as individuals are, as an individual driver, I know I'm like, okay, well, where's the space closest to the front door of the Publix? That in a downtown area, things are different. And we're not going to get a parking space out front of the door of every destination that we have. If we do that, we already have a model for that. It's called US 41 in Port Charlotte. You can park in front of any door there you want to. If you want downtown to look like that, then we can change the codes tomorrow to make that happen. But I don't think that's what we want as a community. So we really have to carefully consider how we're going to handle parking. Another piece of the equation is transportation, just like shopping and office space, is changing radically because of communications and the computer age. We may get to a point 15, 20, 30 years from now where most of us don't own private automobiles anymore, but we all get around by car because they're all zipping around and driving themselves. Do I think that's going to happen tomorrow? No. But if we have the more parking spaces that we have, especially structured parking spaces, and they're not convertible into other uses, we may have a problem moving into the future of a dead downtown where there are millions and millions of dollars worth of private and public infrastructure that's not useful in the modern world.
Okay, a question, and I'm going to piggyback on this question with a question of my own. The question is, who in the city will decide if a development proposal meets the form-based codes requirement? Is it going to be urban design or the building department or development review committee? And I want to piggyback on that with a question about what are we doing for the next year, Mitchell? How are we handling developers who want to come in and develop now? And maybe with a plan that we're going like, we have this vision and you don't really, it's not fitting our new vision. How are we going to handle that?
So to answer the first question, to answer the first part of that question first. So, and I'm going to fall back on, I've never been a private developer. I've always worked in the public sector in planning, but I spend a lot of time trying to get into the heads of the private development community to understand what the challenges and opportunities they face are, so that I have a better understanding of how we can encourage and incentivize and regulate development to ensure that it meets our goals as a community. So one thing that I can tell you is developers live in a very unpredictable world at the whims of the financial markets in terms of getting a project constructed, and at the whims of the real estate market. So who's the end user? And they're in the middle of that equation between financing, the capital markets, Wall Street, banks, whomever, and the general public and what they are going to expect in terms of office space, retail space, restaurants, living space. So they have a very complex job, and there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty there for them. And one of the things that we can provide as a municipality to ensure that we provide a platform for developers to build is predictability. And form-based codes are really designed for predictability. If we put in those form-based codes, this is what we as a community want and expect, then regardless of who the developer is or what the proposal is, we as a community, through us, the hired hands of city staff, are going to be able to look at the code and say, this either does fit it or doesn't. And if it does fit it, then it goes through the regular sort of technical approval process to make sure all the boxes are checked. If it does not fit our vision, it does not fit our rules, if they're written well, then they have the opportunity, because of the way that Florida land use law is structured, they have the opportunity to make an application to City Council to change something. And that's where you get into that public process. Now, the average developer, and I'm talking people who develop a single lot all the way to people who build, mixed use developments of 20 or 30 acres in major metropolitan cities. Those developers love certainty and hate the uncertainty of the public process. So the thing that they look for is a plan that allows them to build what they need to build to meet the market dynamics of the capital markets and the end user real estate market. And they don't have to go through the public hearing process because the community's telling them very explicitly, this is exactly what we want. So that's the critical role for me, is to make sure that our land development regulations match your desires as a community in terms of what you want to see, to empower the private sector to build the city of tomorrow that we envision in our minds. So that's critical to me. The second part of your question, if you could repeat it, I would love.
So we're talking about a year here before our form-based codes are completed. How are we going to handle those developers who are coming in now with development projects? And you're going like, well, we have this vision for our community and this doesn't exactly fit that. Can you wait a while? I don't think they will. How are we going to handle that?
So I can say there's really two tracks on that. As far as conventional development, so those areas outside of the area that we're talking about, development activity has more or less slowed. I mean, I was here in the pre-crash era, and the quantity of development that we were experiencing then was actually higher than it is now in terms of both commercial, multifamily, or single family residential, and especially multifamily residential, that those markets were booming. In terms of multifamily residential, essentially we haven't seen any. There's been one or two buildings built, but almost nothing in the last 11 years compared to what occurred between 2004, Hurricane Charlie, and 2010, when the last boom building was completed, our boom development was completed. So we have the benefit of a market that in those areas that is more or less stable. In the area that City Council has directed us to focus change on, in the downtown core and surrounding neighborhoods, those surrounding neighborhoods are building out at a pretty good clip, especially in the western neighborhood. But primarily that's single family development. That's what's actually desired in that area. So the only conflict is in the details, like that issue that came up earlier with grading and fill and the potential for adverse drainage impacts on adjacent, especially historic properties. So that's an issue that we're already addressing. We're trying to figure out possible solutions. On the other side, on commercial and mixed use development side, I can tell you that in the last 15 or the last, beginning of 16 years, the current land development regulations were adopted in March of 2005. Those land development regulations provided a platform for mixed use development. By and large, with the exception of Sunloft Center, we have not seen that type of development occur. And there are two market reasons for that. The first is that the residential densities are too low, and the development projects just don't pencil out. You can't make the numbers work with the residential density entitlements that are available. The other side of the coin is what I was talking about earlier with my office cell phone and my personal cell phone being the shopping mall and the office of the future. The commercial market demand for for retail space and for especially commodity retail space. So, you know, the Joe Suburbia kind of development. That's really super depressed over the last particularly 5 to 10 years and accelerating in depression type conditions. So there's no demand for building that type of stuff. And then on the office side, we're also seeing that similar metric, and those are nationwide, statewide, and regional trends that I followed through the Urban Land Institute and American Planning Association and others, and the commercial real estate industry professionals that I know and speak to in the area. The one sort of shining bright spot in terms of commercial development over the last few years has been in what we call sort of the experiential submarket. So we're all social creatures. I think this year has told us more than ever that we're social creatures and we want to be with each other in community. We want to see and be seen. We want to dine together, be entertained together. And that's what the experiential sector of the real estate commercial real estate market's really looking at. You know, where are the signature sort of restaurants, entertainment venues, you know, your average coffee shop. That's an experience. Yeah, you can get a cup of coffee from a pot in your house, but the experience of going to the coffee shop is to see and be seen. It's a social dynamic beyond the caffeine fix. So that's the type of development that you would actually want to encourage in a downtown area. So there are some bright prospects for development there. However, there's a delta between, or there's a significant difference between the land costs, which are baked in, and the ability to produce those types of facilities as standalone. You need another component in order to make the project work. So under the current dynamics of our land code, I really don't anticipate a developer coming in and saying, we're going to redevelop this right now, and it doesn't meet our plan, because they're just not coming. They haven't come in the past 15 years. I don't anticipate them coming in the next year or two, especially, you know, we're going to be dealing with the fallout, the economic fallout, particularly on a commercial real estate basis, from this pandemic for the foreseeable future. The current economic forecasts are like 24, 25 before we see full market recovery. And we don't know what the shape of that market will be for office and retail.
Okay. I think we have one final question, and it's a good one to end on because it's talking about our future population. And you know, we need to look again at our current demographic and where we're going. Mm-hmm. You talked about the millennials. Do you see the type of people moving to Punta Gorda changing as the younger generations become the majority? So
it's actually an interesting question, but it kind of, it's like which is more important, the cart or the horse? We are, and we always will be, primarily a retirement community. Nobody moves to this part of Florida because corporate told them to. You know, the central office doesn't tell you to move to Punta Gorda to do, you know, to work on the corporate business. We're all more or less here by choice. So the types of people that are going to continue to choose this community are going to be primarily those that have chosen it in the past. So upper middle income retirees. Those are the people that are going to choose to live here in the future. The millennials, the future that I'm talking about, the richest millennials will be 50, 55 in 10 and 15 years. They're our target demographic for buying the single family homes that we all live in now. So yes, the answer is, do I anticipate the millennials moving here? Of course, because they have to move here or nobody's going to buy your house from you or your heirs moving into the future, and the economic structure and physical structure of the city will collapse. The flip side of that is, what do then what does the next generation anticipate? And I've seen this shift even in terms of the retirees that I've seen move to our community over the past 15 years. And this is really a shift within the baby boom generation. The expectation of the younger baby boomers upon retirement, what they were looking for is markedly different than what the first wave of baby boom retirees was looking for. So the focus of a plurality of those younger baby boom retirees is looking for, okay, well, what are the bicycling and walking opportunities? What are the other recreational opportunities? Where am I going to get my fancy cup of coffee that I'm used to in the city where I lived all my life? Those are the types of things that they expected from this community. And by and large, we've met those expectations. The question is, what is the expectations of those millennial generation? The other side of it is having the workforce availability to meet those expectations. So are we able to keep the young kids who staff the barista counter at Starbucks? Are those young men and women going to choose to stay in this community because they see a future here? Or are they, like many other people, including my fiance, who grew up in this town back in the 80s, she left. She said, I don't want to have anything to do with Punta Gorda. So they leave as soon as they can. And that's been the pattern. The best and the brightest have typically left the Punta Gorda community, and they may gravitate back at some point in their lives, like my fiance did. But retaining that talent locally and having them available to serve as the workforce to enable the retiree population to continue to be as big and as strong and as important to our economy as it is, that's what we've got to focus on to make our community complete and whole. So I know it's a long-winded answer. I'm sorry. I'm a planner. I spend my entire time talking, writing, and otherwise communicating these ideas and thinking about them. I appreciate all your time and patience with me, and I hope this was helpful to you.
Definitely helpful. And I think it's going to be a very exciting time for Punta Gorda for the next year. And I hope that all of you will continue to engage. This is what the city wants, is they want citizen engagement. And we will continue at PGI Civic to try and bring these opportunities to you. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and we appreciate it. And I hopefully, if you want the view the recording or suggest it to someone else, it will be available on the city website. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much again. Bye-bye.